Did you catch that? Do not fret yourself. Do not fret yourself because of evildoers. Do not fret yourself over the one who prospers and succeeds in evil schemes. Do not fret yourself. Do not let anger and rage define you. Do not fret yourself. So friends, the rest of the stories. You may remember last week, we heard the first part of Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, Luke's version of what Matthew calls the Sermon on the Mount. And in last week's reading, we heard the parts, the blessings and the woes. Blessings, turning the world upside down, proclaiming God's blessing in those places where the world would not say were blessings. For the poor, the hungry, those who mourn, those who are reviled and ignored. And woe to the rich, the full, those who are laughing, those who are well regarded. And a reminder that the woes are not a curse. It's a caution, like, whoa, yikes. In other words, don't rely on these things that the world identifies as success. God sees the world differently. And that's where today's reading picks up. And in Greek, it picks up with a sort of a conjunction, Greek conjunction, sometimes translated as and or but in this case, it's more like rather. It's sort of, as opposed to that, instead this. And we hear Jesus not making any of this any easier for us, friends. Like last week was rough, right? Last week was like, are you kidding me, Jesus? Okay, all right, we got this. And now I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. But he says it again. Again, Jesus, really? But love your enemies. He didn't just say it once. He knew he had to say it at least twice. And you'll be children of the Most High. And all these things he asks us to do, to love our enemies, to be merciful, to forgive, he anchors not just in an idea that it's a nice thing to do, but because these are qualities in the very heart of God. Be merciful as my Father, as your Father is merciful. And then I asked Deacon Pete to keep reading, because Easter is not on April 27th, it's on April 20th, which puts us, it shortens our Epiphany by a week. And it means we wouldn't have heard the rest of this passage, because next week we'll have the story of the Transfiguration. It's always that last Sunday before Lent we hear the Transfiguration. And I wanted you to hear the rest of Jesus' sermon, because this is how he brings it home. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Oh, come on, Jesus. Just pull your punches, why don't you? Each tree is known by its own fruit. The good person out of the good treasure of their heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. For it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. And then he uses this amazing story of the one building a house and digging deeply and laying the foundation on rock versus the one who builds a house on the sand. And only the one built on the foundation of rock can withstand the raging flood. Love your enemies, he says, more than once. And we might think this was just Jesus being impossible. Jesus being Jesus and expecting of us something that only he is capable of. And it's not far from that. But actually, we have this story from Genesis that tells us it's not impossible. And this isn't a new idea. I encourage you actually to go ahead if you're kicking back. You know, there's no football to watch this afternoon, so maybe you'll be kicking back and you can read the previous chapters in Genesis. parts of the Joseph story. And remember, Joseph was the favored son. His brothers did not appreciate this. They got very jealous of their father's affection and didn't just pull a prank on Joseph. They first plotted to kill him, then they decided to leave him for dead, and then they said, well, we could make some money out of this, let's sell him into slavery instead. And he ends up in slavery in Egypt, which is not a place where you want to be in slavery, as if you could say anything of the sort. But then these crazy things happen to him while he's there, some devastatingly awful and some quite remarkable. And then they show up on his doorstep. If anyone had a right to be angry, full of rage, full of grievance and resentment, it's Joseph. But it's really clear here that he has not spent the last decades cultivating grievance in his heart. Now, to be fair, the previous chapters that I alluded to are full of him living into his full trickster personality and narrative type. He has some fun with them. I won't lie. Go read the story. He does kind of pull one over on them because he's a trickster. The apple doesn't fall from the tree. Jacob was a trickster and Joseph's a trickster, and he gets them a little. But really at the heart of even that is his desire to see his younger brother, who did not sell him into slavery, and to find out how is Dad. How is Dad? It's an amazing story. And then Joseph miraculously is able to see the hand of God in all of this and claim everything that happened to him, for good or for ill, claim all of it for God. It's something that only a heart of transforming love can pull off. Now, it is important to say, only Joseph gets to say that the terrible things that happened to him were of God. Nobody else gets to look at Joseph's trauma and say, God did something good for you out of your trauma, Joseph. No one gets to do that but Joseph. Follow me? We don't get to see someone who's been oppressed and tell them that God meant it for good. We don't get to do that. Only Joseph gets to do that for Joseph. But he does. And he can see God at work. He can see God at work. And similarly, we don't get to turn anybody else's cheek. If we choose to turn our own cheek, that's a different story. We don't get to throw an oppressed people under the bus. That's not how this works. But when we work for justice, when we work for the healing of this world, when we work for the unfolding of God's dream, it matters deeply that we are doing so with a foundation of love. And it matters so much that in our psalm that we are gifted with today, again, it's hard. It's hard to do this. It is hard to do this work with a heart of love. Sometimes we're human. This world makes it harder, but that's also not new. This psalm is ancient, and even this psalm has to say not once, not twice, but 3 times, do not fret yourself. Did you catch that? Do not fret yourself. Do not fret yourself because of evildoers. Do not fret yourself over the one who prospers and succeeds in evil schemes. Do not fret yourself. Do not let anger and rage define you. Do not fret yourself. All of this vengeance that is also alluded to in this psalm belongs to who? God. It's God's. Again, God needs us to do the work in this world. God needs us to be God's people in this world. When we answer that call, will you come and follow me? It's because there's work to do. But it needs to be done with a foundation of love. And that's why it is important for us to dig deep and find that love, even though it is so very hard sometimes. We don't do it alone. We don't do it on our own strength or our own capacity for love. Thanks be to God. We do it with the promise of God's love, because God is loving and God is forgiving and God is merciful. And it is out of the abundance of that love that we can even hope to do this work with love of our own. But it matters. I'm reminded, it's like the second week in a row that I've been reminded of things Bono has said. But those of you who've loved U2 for a long time might remember that after September 11th, one of the things Bono said is, it is super important that we not become monsters in our fight against evil. We need to not become the monster we are fighting. Everything we do must come from love. And the only way we can do that is God's love. And that, I think, is where Paul is heading with the alternative passage. I encourage you, if you really want some more Pauline fun, to read the alternative passage from Corinthians. He tries his best to bring it home, but for 3 weeks he's been doing his best to talk about resurrection. Sounds like he's even kind of got his own tongue tangled in this passage, just actually rather typical of Paul. But he's got people asking, what does resurrection mean? Not in a how do we live, but like, what kind of body? Like we would say in the sort of post-Enlightenment world, well, how do the molecules work? And Paul's saying you're asking the wrong question. It's not about that. It's not about how the resurrection. It's what are you going to do with this gift? God has overcome the very power of death on our behalf. What will you do with that gift? That is the important question. My friends, the answer needs to begin with love.